We were looking for a weekend getaway, just the two of us, a chance to escape the noise and demands of everyday life. My girlfriend, Leah, and I had been together for a few years, and we both loved being out in nature. So when we found this cabin deep in the woods, it seemed like the perfect spot. It was one of those places you'd find on a hidden corner of Airbnb, a cabin that seemed so isolated that it felt almost like it was lost in time, far from the distractions of the modern world. The listing promised privacy, serenity, and a chance to truly unwind, so we booked it. When we arrived, it was everything we had hoped for. The cabin was tucked away at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by towering pine trees that stretched up to the sky, and there was nothing but miles of wilderness around it. The air was crisp and fresh, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves were the only things we could hear. The cabin itself was a small, wooden structure with a stone fireplace and an old rocking chair on the porch. It had a rustic charm to it, like something out of a movie. We spent the first evening enjoying each other's company, cooking a simple dinner and laughing about old stories. It was peaceful, relaxing, exactly what we needed. After we ate, we settled in front of the fire with a couple of beers and let the warmth of the flames soak into our tired bones. The whole world outside seemed to fade away, and we felt like we were the only people alive, just the two of us and the forest. But that peace didn't last. It started late that second night, around 2 a.m. We had turned off the lights and were lying in bed, talking quietly, our voices barely above a whisper. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to embers, and the cabin was wrapped in darkness, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering in through the windows. That's when we heard it. First, I thought it was just the wind. The forest was dense, and trees creaked in the breeze, so it was easy to imagine the sounds were just the wind pushing branches around. But then I heard something else, a heavy step, like the crunch of boots on dry leaves. I wasn't sure at first. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature moving around the cabin. We were in the woods, after all. I didn't say anything to Leah right away, but after a few moments, I heard it again, closer this time. Another step, then another. My heart started to race. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just some wild animal. But then the footsteps seemed to move around the cabin. The sound was unmistakable, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around the outside of the house. I lay there, trying to figure out what was going on. I couldn't hear any more animal sounds, no scurrying of small feet or the rustle of leaves, just the crunch of boots on the ground, moving in a slow circle around the cabin, as if someone was pacing. I turned to Leah, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her eyes wide. "Yeah, I hear it." The footsteps kept going, round and round the cabin like they were circling it. No pause, no change in pace. It was as if whoever or whatever was out there was taking their time, walking with purpose. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The logical part of my brain tried to reason that it was an animal, maybe a bear or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. Something about it felt wrong. It didn't have the randomness of an animal. This was deliberate. I got up, motioning for Leah to stay in bed. My mind raced with thoughts. Should we check it out? Should we call someone? But who would even come out here in the middle of the night? We were so far out, cell service was spotty at best. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, its beam weak and flickering as I turned it on. We had no phone signal, no way to reach anyone, and the woods around the cabin were pitch black. I made my way to the door slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The footsteps continued, steady and unrelenting. Leah stayed in bed, but I could tell she was just as freaked out as I was. I had to know what was going on, so I cracked open the door just a little, shining the flashlight out into the darkness. For a few moments, there was nothing, just the darkness and the distant sound of leaves rustling in the trees. I took a step outside, the cold night air hitting me immediately. The light from the flashlight bounced off the trees, but everything around us was silent. Then I froze. Right in front of the door, just a few feet away, were fresh human footprints in the dirt. They were clear, too clear. Big, heavy impressions in the ground. Whoever it was, they had been standing right there at the edge of the porch just watching the cabin. The prints weren't old either. They were fresh, the dirt still slightly disturbed as if they'd been made only minutes before. I quickly scanned the area around us. The footsteps were not random. They led right up to the door, right to where we stood. I pulled my head back inside, my pulse racing. "Leah, we need to leave. Now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but failing miserably. The panic was starting to creep in, but I couldn't let it overwhelm me. We couldn't stay here. We couldn't risk it. Leah jumped out of bed, her face pale, eyes wide. "What's going on? Who's out there?" "I don't know, but I'm not taking any chances. We're leaving." I grabbed my bag, quickly shoving things into it without really thinking. My hands were shaking, but I had to keep it together. We didn't have much time. We both moved quickly through the cabin, collecting our things and packing them into the car. The silence outside was deafening now, but I could still feel the weight of someone watching us. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the trees, watching us in the shadows. We piled into the car and slammed the doors shut. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the engine roared to life as I pulled out of the driveway. We didn't even say anything as we drove away. We were both too shaken. But as we rounded the bend in the road and the cabin came into view in the rearview mirror, something made my blood run cold. Standing in the doorway of the cabin, silhouetted against the faint glow of the lights inside, was a figure. I could barely make out the shape, tall, standing perfectly still, just watching us as we drove away. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as we sped down the road, but the image of that figure stayed burned in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it, wondering who it was, why they were there, and what they wanted. We didn't stop again until we reached the nearest town, where we found a small motel and checked in for the night. Neither of us could sleep, and we spent the hours lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The thought of that figure watching us still haunted us. The next morning, we drove back to the cabin during daylight, hoping to figure out what had happened. But when we arrived, the cabin was completely empty. No signs of anyone being there, no footprints in the dirt. It was as if the whole thing had been a bad dream. We checked the locks and everything seemed fine, but the eerie feeling never left. We didn't stick around. After a quick glance at the cabin, we turned around and left, driving far away, not stopping until we were miles and miles from that place. We never talked about it much after that, but neither of us ever felt comfortable in the woods again. The memory of those footsteps, the figure standing in the doorway, was something we couldn't shake. And as far as I'm concerned, some places are better left undisturbed, no matter how beautiful they seem at first. The cabin was off the grid, in a spot where people might not even know you were missing. It's easy to imagine that whoever, whatever, was out there that night was used to being alone in the dark. It was the woods, after all. I needed to get away. Life had been weighing on me for months, and the constant stress from work, family, and everything else was starting to feel like too much. I was burning out, and I just needed some peace. So, I decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods, far away from everything. I found a little place about 2 hours outside the city, tucked into a thick forest, perfect for what I needed. Some quiet, some solitude, and hopefully, a chance to clear my head. The first night there was peaceful. I arrived just as the sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the trees. The cabin was small but cozy, made of old wood that creaked underfoot. There was a fireplace and a small kitchen, and a bed by the window that overlooked the forest. I was alone, and for the first time in a while, I could breathe without feeling like I was drowning in responsibilities. I spent that night reading a book, drinking some wine, and letting my mind unwind. The quiet was almost deafening. It was the kind of stillness that you don't realize you miss until you experience it again. I had no phone service, no Wi-Fi, and nothing to distract me except the sounds of the forest outside. It felt like a world away from everything. I was looking forward to the next few days of complete isolation. But then the second night came. It started out the same, peaceful and quiet, but around midnight, I started hearing something. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. A soft, rhythmic thud, almost like footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the cabin, or maybe some animals up in the attic. The cabin had an old, creaky feel to it, so I figured it was just part of the place settling. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but it wouldn't stop. The sound continued for what felt like hours, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was up there. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon or some other small animal had gotten into the attic. I had checked the cabin when I arrived, and everything seemed fine, but still, I couldn't quite calm my nerves. The third night was when things really started to unravel. I was in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard it again. The same sound, but this time it was louder, clearer. It wasn't just thuds anymore. It was like someone was walking around up there. Slow, deliberate steps, one after another. My heart started to race, and I pulled the covers up around my neck. I knew I should have checked the attic earlier, but I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. That night, though, it didn't stop. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the footsteps overhead. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. It was probably just the wind, or the house settling more. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I could feel my anxiety starting to build, but I kept telling myself to stay calm, that I was just overreacting. Around 2 a.m., I heard something different. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was a voice, soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. My name, Sarah. I froze. My heart stopped for a moment, and the blood drained from my face. It was coming from the attic. My name clear as day. I lay still, not moving, not breathing, unsure if I had imagined it. But no, there it was again. My name, Sarah. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my pulse thundering in my ears. I sat up in bed, the weight of fear pressing on my chest. There was no way anyone could have been up there. The cabin was supposed to be empty, and the owner had assured me that everything was safe. But that voice, it didn't feel like just my imagination. It was too real, too close. I didn't know what to do. I considered calling the police, but how could I explain this? The thought of walking into that attic alone terrified me. But I had to know. I had to find out what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and slowly got out of bed. The silence was oppressive. Every step I took felt like it was echoing in the cabin. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the attic door. It was a small, wooden hatch in the ceiling, with a rope ladder that you had to pull down to access the attic. The noise had stopped, but the fear didn't leave. I stood there for a moment, just listening. The house was quiet now. The only sound was the wind howling outside. I took a deep breath, mustered every ounce of courage I had, and pulled down the ladder. I climbed up slowly, the wooden rungs creaking under my weight. The attic was dusty, filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten things. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. There was nothing up there. No sign of anyone, no animals, nothing out of place. I let out a shaky breath and walked around, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just the stress getting to me. Maybe the noise had been nothing. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A dark shape in the far corner of the attic. I froze. There was something there, something out of place. I couldn't quite make it out, but it was large and dark, like a figure. My heart started to race again, and my breathing became shallow. I pointed the flashlight at it, and for a split second, it looked like there was someone standing in the shadows watching me. But when I blinked, the shape was gone. I was out of there in a flash. I slammed the attic hatch shut, pulled the ladder up, and bolted downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt like I was being suffocated, like the air in the cabin had turned thick and heavy. I tried to calm myself, tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my keys and phone, intending to leave, but then I heard it again, that soft voice. Sarah. It was coming from right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The cabin was empty. I could hear my heart thudding in my ears as I ran out of the cabin, through the front door, and to my car. I didn't even bother locking up. I just jumped in, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, and my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. I drove as fast as I could, not even sure where I was going, just far away from that cabin. The drive back home was a blur. I didn't stop once, didn't look back, didn't even slow down. The only thing that mattered was getting away. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake the dread that had followed me. I needed to know if what had happened at the cabin was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. So, I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through the pictures I had taken during my trip. I didn't even remember taking half of them, but there they were. The cabin, the forest, the little details I had tried to capture. Then I got to the pictures I had taken of the cabin at sunset. The last one I'd taken before I left. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. In the window of the attic, just barely visible in the corner of the frame, was a figure. It was hard to make out at first, but as I zoomed in, it became clear. Person, standing in the attic window, watching me as I took the picture. I hadn't seen them when I was taking the photo, but there they were, clear as day, standing still and silent in the shadows. I don't know who or what it was, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't imagining it. That voice, those footsteps, the figure in the window, it all happened. And now, every time I close my eyes, I can't shake the feeling that someone or something is still watching me. It was late afternoon when we arrived at the cabin. I could feel the air shifting as we pulled up the long dirt road, the trees growing thicker, the sky turning a faint orange. The place was tucked far back in the woods, almost as if it were hidden. We had booked it for the weekend, wanting to get away from everything. A break from the noise, the people, the constant rush of daily life. The cabin seemed like the perfect spot, isolated, peaceful. We could just breathe for a bit. But as soon as I stepped out of the car, something felt off. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, the edges of the gravel scattered in patches, like no one had bothered to tend to it for a while. I could tell the place hadn't been cared for, but maybe that was just part of its charm, I thought. The whole idea of renting a secluded cabin in the woods meant a little rough around the edges, right? I grabbed the bag out of the trunk and walked up the steps to the front door. The door, it was slightly ajar. I stopped, staring at it for a second. No one else was supposed to be here, not that I knew of. My partner, Jamie, was already behind me, walking toward the door with a casual attitude. "Looks like it hasn't been locked in a while," Jamie said, a small grin on their face. "Or it's been broken into," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth, a shiver passing through me, even though I wasn't sure why. But we both shrugged it off. After all, we were here for the weekend, and we didn't have anywhere else to go. I pushed the door open fully, the creak of the hinges too loud in the silence. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Musty, like old wood, a little damp, a little stale. I stepped inside and looked around. The place was run down. The living room was dark with dust-covered furniture. A couch that looked as though it hadn't been sat on in years. Chairs that had collected dust in the corners, the carpet worn thin and stained in places. It was like someone had been trying to keep it together, but eventually gave up. "Well, this is not what I expected," Jamie muttered, stepping inside after me, their voice trailing off. They sounded disappointed, but we both were too tired to argue. After a long drive, we needed somewhere to sleep. We could make it work. It was just a cabin, right? I put my bag down on the couch, feeling the dust on my fingers as I touched the armrest. The whole place felt stale. I wondered when the last time anyone had stayed here was. A few months? Maybe longer? It didn't matter. We were here now. We explored a bit, but honestly, we didn't want to look too closely at the condition of things. The kitchen had a few odd stains on the floor, like someone had spilled something and not cleaned it up. The walls were peeling, and the cabinets had that old, greasy look to them, as if they'd been used for decades without a second thought. Still, it wasn't terrible. It wasn't as if we couldn't manage. As the light outside began to fade and the first stars showed up in the sky, we decided to settle in for the night. I was in the kitchen trying to cook something when I heard it. At first, it was so quiet I thought it was just the wind or the house settling. But then, a strange creaking sound echoed from above. It wasn't the usual old house creak. It was deliberate, almost rhythmic, like someone was walking upstairs. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning toward Jamie, who had been scrolling through their phone on the couch. "Hear what?" Jamie asked, not looking up. "Footsteps upstairs," I said, slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "There's someone up there." Jamie laughed a little, a nervous laugh. "It's just an old house. It's probably just the house settling or the wind." But the sound wasn't right. It was too deliberate, too human. I waited a moment longer, and sure enough, it came again. One step, another, the creak of floorboards above us. I felt my heart rate pick up, a cold sweat starting at the back of my neck. "I'm going up," I said, deciding that if there was someone up there, I needed to know who. Jamie didn't protest. Maybe they thought I was overreacting, but the unease in their voice told me they felt it too. We moved quietly through the house. I headed for the stairs, and Jamie followed a few steps behind, their footsteps heavy in the quiet of the cabin. The stairs creaked under our weight, the old wood groaning like it hadn't been walked on in ages. I reached the top and froze. The door to the bedroom at the end of the hallway was wide open, and there was no sound, no movement, but I still had that feeling, like something was off. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by the last of the fading daylight filtering through the windows. The bed was made, the sheets pulled taut, and the pillows fluffed. But there was something about it, something I couldn't put my finger on. Jamie stood at the doorway, leaning against the frame. "This is weird," they muttered, walking in. "Looks like someone was here recently, don't you think?" I felt a chill run through me. I hadn't been expecting to find the bed made. Why would the place be so dusty and abandoned looking, but the bed be neatly made, as if someone had just slept there? I stepped closer to the bed, my fingers brushing over the blanket. Felt wrong, like someone had been here and then left. "Let's just go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My instinct was to leave right then, but Jamie wanted to check things out, look around more. As we turned to leave, that's when I saw it. The dust. On the windowsill where the light barely touched. There were handprints, fresh handprints. I could tell by the way the dust had been disturbed. There was no way those prints had been there long. Someone had placed their hands there just hours ago, or maybe minutes ago. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been in this room. Recently. I turned back to Jamie, my breath quickening. "Jamie, look." Jamie's eyes widened as they saw the prints, their expression shifting from curiosity to unease. "What the hell?" My heart was pounding. The hair on my arms stood up. Something was very wrong. We didn't say much as we left the room. Our footsteps hurried and heavier than before. We headed back downstairs, my eyes darting around, scanning for any other signs that someone had been here. But the house was silent. Nothing but the sound of our quick breathing and the creaking of the old wood underfoot. "Let's go," I said, almost pleading. I could feel the panic starting to rise in me, and I knew I didn't want to be here anymore. Not for a second longer. We rushed to the front door, our feet stumbling over the uneven floor. The door slammed shut behind us, and we hurried to the car, throwing the bags into the trunk. The car engine roared to life, and we sped down the gravel driveway, the tires kicking up dust behind us. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. I told myself it was just my nerves, just the fear. But as we passed the cabin, I saw it. A shadow in the window, a faint silhouette, someone standing in the darkness, watching us leave. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I didn't know who it was, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't alone in that cabin. We didn't look back, not even once. I didn't care what it was. The only thing that mattered was getting as far away as possible. The first day at the cabin was perfect, just what we needed. After months of busy schedules and endless work, we were finally getting a week to ourselves in the middle of nowhere. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The kids were excited to be out in nature, and my wife and I were just happy to be away from our phones and emails. We arrived in the afternoon, and the cabin looked just as it had in the photos we'd seen online. It was a rustic, wooden structure with a large front porch that overlooked a small creek. There were tall trees surrounding the cabin, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was crisp, and the sound of birds chirping added to the peace of the place. We couldn't have asked for a better spot to unwind. After unpacking our bags and getting settled in, we spent the rest of the day exploring the area. The kids played in the creek, skipping rocks and laughing. My wife and I sat on the porch, enjoying the quiet and the cool shade of the trees. We had no immediate neighbors, and the only sounds were the wind through the leaves and the occasional call of a distant animal. It felt like we were the only people in the world. That night, after a homemade dinner of grilled steaks and baked potatoes, we sat inside by the fire, watching a movie on the old TV in the corner of the living room. The cabin felt cozy, with its wood paneling and stone fireplace. I remember feeling completely at ease. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The night was calm, peaceful, just like everything had been so far. But that peace didn't last. The next evening, things started to feel off. It was a little thing at first, nothing too strange, just the feeling that something wasn't right. We had finished dinner early and decided to spend the evening relaxing. Maybe play a few board games or read a book. It was still light outside when the kids ran outside to play, so my wife and I stayed inside, enjoying the silence. Around 9:30, when it started to get dark, we decided to call it a night. The kids came back in and we locked the door as we had done the night before. But when I went to grab the keys to the door, I couldn't find them. I checked the counter, the table, the little basket by the door where we usually kept them, but they were nowhere to be found. I figured I might have misplaced them, so I searched the living room, then the kitchen, then the bedrooms. No luck. I checked every possible place they could have been. "Where are the keys?" my wife asked, sounding just as puzzled as I was. I didn't have an answer. We both looked at each other, a little confused now, but not yet worried. Maybe one of the kids had picked them up and left them somewhere. So we asked the kids if they had seen the keys, but they hadn't. They hadn't touched them. It didn't make any sense. I went outside to take a breather on the porch. The cool night air was refreshing, and the crickets were loud in the darkness. As I leaned against the railing, I glanced through the window at the kitchen, and there, right on the counter, was the set of keys. They were clearly visible through the window. I could hardly believe my eyes. How had they ended up there? I quickly rushed back inside, but when I entered the cabin, the keys were gone. Just like that, the counter was empty again. I was getting irritated now, but my frustration turned into a strange kind of unease. Something about all of this felt off. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it was locked from the inside. I couldn't make sense of it. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my hand still on the handle. How could the door be locked from the inside if we hadn't locked it? I told my wife, and she seemed just as confused. We both stood there in the entryway, not sure what to do. I suggested that we call the sheriff just to get some clarity. Maybe someone had been playing a prank on us, though I couldn't imagine who would do something like that in such an isolated spot. I went outside again, this time to use my phone and call the local sheriff's department. The signal was weak, but I managed to get through. The dispatcher promised to send someone out as soon as possible, but it would take a while. It wasn't like there was much of a police presence out here in the woods. In the meantime, my wife and I went through the cabin again, checking for any signs that we might have missed, but nothing stood out. There were no signs of forced entry or any unusual disturbances. Everything seemed just as it had the first day we arrived, except for the missing keys and the locked door. By the time the sheriff finally arrived, It was nearly 11 p.m. The sheriff, a man in his late 40s with a weathered face and a deep voice, stepped out of his cruiser and walked toward the cabin. He didn't seem particularly alarmed, more curious than anything. "You folks need help?" he asked, looking at me with a raised eyebrow. I quickly explained the situation, about the keys disappearing and the door locking from the inside. He nodded but didn't seem overly concerned. "We get a lot of people who rent these cabins, and they're usually a bit old. Sometimes things don't work right, or people forget where they put stuff." "I'm telling you," I said. "The keys were right there on the counter. I saw them through the window." The sheriff gave me a skeptical look, then walked up to the door. He tried the handle, and of course it was locked from the inside. He tapped on the window a few times and peered inside, but he didn't seem surprised. After a few minutes of checking the door and the window, he pulled out a flashlight and started looking around the yard. I stood in the doorway, feeling more and more unsettled. "What do you think is going on?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though I was starting to panic inside. "Nothing," he said simply. "This place is empty. No one's been here for years. There are no other cabins around here." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, empty?" "Like I said," he replied, "this place has been vacant for years. They haven't rented it out in a long time. You're the first ones in a while." I didn't know what to make of that. I glanced around the yard, noticing for the first time how still everything was. It was dead quiet, the only sound being the occasional rustle of the leaves. I turned back to the sheriff. "Are you sure this cabin is safe to stay in?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "It's fine," he said. "Probably just a mix-up with the keys. Someone must have misplaced them. Happens all the time." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't have any other options. The sheriff didn't seem concerned, and neither did my wife, though I could tell she was just as uneasy as I was. In the end, the sheriff gave us his card and told us to call if we needed anything else. He left without any further explanation, driving off down the dark road. We stood in the quiet cabin for a moment, both of us thinking the same thing. Something wasn't right, but we were too tired to think about it too much. We decided to try to get some sleep, hoping that the morning would bring clarity. The next day, we packed our things and checked every corner of the cabin one last time, but we still couldn't find the keys. By noon, we were ready to leave. I was uncomfortable staying any longer, but we had no choice. We left the cabin and drove down the long dirt road, eager to get out of the woods. As we passed the sheriff's department on our way out, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about the whole situation. The keys, the locked door, the sheriff's strange reaction. None of it made sense, but I didn't dwell on it. We had a long drive ahead of us, and I was just ready to go home. We never found the keys. To this day, I still don't know where they went or how they ended up on the counter only to disappear again. But one thing I know for sure, there was something strange about that cabin, and I'm glad we left when we did. I don't think we'll ever go back. The wind was unforgiving. It howled through the trees like an angry beast, its gusts strong enough to almost knock me off my feet as I stumbled through the woods. My heart pounded in my chest with every step, every crack of a twig beneath my boots. I had lost track of time, and my sense of direction had all but vanished along with the sun, which had dipped behind a thick blanket of clouds hours ago. The storm was closing in fast, and I could feel the weight of the cold creeping into my bones. I had been hiking for the past few days, following what I thought was the trail, but somehow, in the middle of this godforsaken forest, it felt like everything was wrong. The trees were too thick, the underbrush too dense. I was lost, and now, with the storm unleashing its fury, I was beginning to panic. The wind kicked up harder, and rain began to lash down in sheets. The forest seemed to close in around me, the dark sky pressing against the tops of the trees. It was difficult to see anything more than a few feet ahead, and I could feel my breath growing short as my anxiety began to spike. I pressed on, though. What else could I do? I had no choice but to keep moving, praying that I would somehow find my way out. That's when I saw it. A small shape ahead in the distance, barely visible through the torrential rain. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, a patch of lighter trees, or an illusion from my fatigue. But as I stumbled forward, the shape became clearer. A cabin. Couldn't believe it. A cabin out here in the middle of nowhere. I was overcome with relief, so much so that I could feel the tension in my shoulders finally start to loosen. I hurried forward, my steps quickening, and before I knew it, I was standing at the front door, my hand trembling as I knocked. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a woman, older than I had expected, but not exactly ancient. She was dressed in simple, dark clothing, with a kind smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her gray hair was pulled back into a loose bun, strands of it falling around her face as she peered out at me. Her eyes, though, seemed sharper than I'd anticipated, clear and focused in a way that made me feel as though she were seeing more than just the soaked, exhausted hiker standing in front of her. "Well, you look like you could use a warm drink," she said, her voice raspy, but kind. "Come in. You're safe here." I hesitated for just a moment, unsure if I should trust this woman, but the storm was raging outside, and the warmth of the cabin was like a lifeline. I stepped inside, letting the door close behind me. The warmth was immediate, and I felt the heat of the fire crackling in the stone hearth hit me like a wall. I could hear the soft hiss of the flames as they burned, the scent of pine and cedar smoke hanging in the air. I looked around, grateful for the shelter, but something about the cabin felt off. The first thing I noticed was the dust. Thick layers of dust covered nearly every surface, on the furniture, the wooden beams of the ceiling, even the windowsills. It was as though no one had bothered to clean in years, and yet the cabin felt lived in. The fire was crackling away, a kettle of water on the stove, and there was a small table with 2 chairs, one of which was pushed out, as if someone had just been sitting there. But the dust, it was everywhere, like a thin film that had settled over everything, untouched by time. I felt my stomach twist slightly, but I forced myself to take a deep breath and focus on the kindness of the woman who had offered me shelter. She led me to the table and poured me a cup of hot tea. The steam rose from the mug, and the scent of chamomile and something earthy filled my nose. I took a sip, savoring the warmth that spread through my body. "You're lucky you found me," she said, her voice quiet as she settled across from me. Her eyes were intense, but there was something comforting about her presence, despite the strange atmosphere in the cabin. "I don't see many travelers out here. Haven't seen anyone in years." I blinked at her words, unsure if she was speaking figuratively or literally. "Years?" I asked, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. "You've been out here all alone for years?" She nodded slowly, the lines of her face softening. "Yes, it's just me. I don't mind it, though. The solitude is peaceful, but it's rare for someone to wander this far off the trail." I glanced around the cabin again, feeling that strange sense of disquiet settle deeper into my bones. There was no sign of any recent activity, aside from the fire and the tea she had prepared. No personal belongings, no evidence of anyone else being around. It was like she had been living here alone, but not in the way a person would, if that made sense. She had the air of someone who had accepted the passage of time, not someone who was actively living in it. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that I was just tired and on edge from being lost in the storm. I took another sip of tea, hoping it would calm my nerves. I needed to get back to town, but first I needed to figure out how to get there. "I should probably be heading back to the trail," I said, setting the mug down on the table. "Do you know the way? I got lost out there." The woman nodded slowly, her gaze flicking toward the door, then back to me. "The trail? Oh, you won't find it now. The storm's too fierce. And anyway, the trail hasn't been there in years." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I was following it. Just a few miles back, there was a marker." She shook her head slowly, a strange, almost sad smile curling on her lips. "That trail's long gone. Hasn't been maintained in decades. If you've been following it, you've been wandering in circles." My heart skipped a beat, and I tried to hide the sudden rush of panic rising in my chest. What do you mean, decades? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. That trail's still listed on the maps. It can't be gone. But the woman only smiled again, the same sad smile, as though she had heard this question 1,000 times before. Sometimes maps lie, but you'll see for yourself soon enough. If you stay too long, the woods will keep you. I stared at her, unsure what she was trying to tell me. The rain outside grew louder, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature creeping up my spine. I stood up, suddenly desperate to leave. I need to go. Thank you for the tea, but I have to go. The woman didn't try to stop me. She simply nodded, her face expressionless. Of course, the woods will be waiting for you. I turned to the door, but as I reached for the handle, something caught my eye. Something odd. There, just out of the corner of my vision, the cabin seemed different. The door frame seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the walls appeared to have grown distant, like the entire structure was shifting, melting into the landscape. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I spun around, but the woman was still sitting at the table, watching me with those sharp, quiet eyes. The storm raged outside, and I knew I had to leave, but the cabin. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. It felt like a dream, like everything was off somehow. I could almost feel the walls closing in. I stepped out into the storm, the door slamming shut behind me with an almost finality that made my blood run cold. I stumbled down the porch steps, but when I looked around, I could see no sign of the cabin. Nothing, just trees. The woods seemed to stretch out endlessly, the rain pouring down in sheets, the wind howling like it had been before. I turned in circles, desperate to find the cabin again, but it was gone. There was no trace of it, no sign that it had ever been there at all. I kept walking, stumbling through the rain, my heart racing. I knew I had to find my way out of the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hours passed as I wandered, unable to find any familiar landmarks, the storm growing worse by the minute. The trees were a blur, the mud slippery beneath my boots, and my exhaustion threatened to pull me under. But still, I pushed forward, driven by the need to get out, to find civilization again. Finally, just as I thought I might collapse, I broke through the tree line. I was out of the forest, the rain still falling in torrents, but I had made it. I stumbled onto the edge of a road, and within the hour, a trucker pulled over to give me a ride. I never saw that cabin again. I searched the woods over the following months, trying to retrace my steps, but there was no sign of it. It was as if it had never existed at all. The map still listed the trail, but I never found it, not in that part of the woods. I don't know what happened out there or what I encountered in that cabin, but it felt too real to be a dream. I've never been able to explain it. All I know is this: the woods have a way of taking things, and sometimes they give them back, but only if they want to. I had been thinking about this for weeks. A solo retreat in a cabin, deep in the mountains, far away from everyone and everything. The idea was to disconnect, clear my head, and just be by myself for a few days. I'd rented the place from a small, local rental company that specialized in remote cabins for those who wanted solitude. It was exactly what I needed after weeks of dealing with work, noise, and the constant hum of city life. No distractions, no obligations, just me and nature. I was looking forward to the peace. I drove up the winding mountain roads, my car hugging the edges of cliffs as I ascended. The cabin was located at the edge of a dense forest, far enough away from the nearest neighbor that the only sounds were the wind and the occasional bird. The place looked perfect. A small, cozy cabin with a stone chimney, surrounded by towering pines and lush underbrush. It looked like the kind of place you see in postcards, with nothing but tranquility to offer. The first night was peaceful. I unpacked my things, made a small fire in the fireplace, and enjoyed the solitude. The cabin was old, but it had been well maintained. The floors creaked in all the right ways, and the wood was warm and inviting. There was a comfortable bed, a small kitchen, and an assortment of books on a shelf. I hadn't planned on doing much but relaxing, so I grabbed a book and sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth as the sun set. By the time I climbed into bed, the world outside was dark, silent, and still. I fell asleep almost instantly, the quiet of the mountains settling over me like a blanket. The next morning, I woke up early, just as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. The air was crisp, and there was a faint mist in the valley below the cabin. I made coffee and sat on the small porch, listening to the sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional distant call of an animal. Everything felt perfect. Over the next couple of days, I did some light hiking and spent a lot of time reading. The weather was beautiful, and the peace of being in the mountains was just what I needed. But something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, but it was a slow, creeping feeling that I was being watched. I would catch glimpses of movement in the trees, just out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the fact that I wasn't used to being so isolated. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. That night, the feeling intensified. As the sun set, I went inside to get some dinner and settled in for the evening. But as I sat in the living room, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing subtle sounds outside, like something moving around the cabin, rustling leaves, the faint crunch of footsteps on the ground. I stood up and peered out the window, but all I could see was the dark outline of trees. Still, the feeling lingered. I turned off the lights, thinking maybe I was just imagining things, and went to bed. The cabin creaked in the night, settling into the cold, but I eventually drifted off to sleep. The next day was a blur of hiking and reading, but the unsettling feeling continued. I began to notice something strange. Every time I looked out the window, there would be something new in the woods, a shape in the distance, a flicker of movement. But when I went outside to check, there was nothing. The trees stood still, the forest as silent as ever. By the third night, I couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at me. I had to check it out. I couldn't just keep living with this nagging feeling. So, after a few hours of sitting in the cabin, listening to the strange sounds outside, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to go out and investigate. The night was colder than usual, and the air felt thick, as if it was holding its breath. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but it felt like the shadows were thicker than they should have been. I slowly made my way around the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. The only sound was my breath, shallow and quick, as I moved toward the tree line. As I stepped closer to the woods, the noises stopped. All at once, the forest became unnervingly still. No rustling leaves, no wind through the branches, just silence. It was as though the entire forest had gone quiet, waiting for something. I stopped walking and scanned the trees, my flashlight darting from one shadow to the next, but I couldn't see anything. Then I heard something, a faint rustling in the underbrush. It wasn't a wind-blown branch or the shift of a tree. No, this was deliberate. Something was moving out there, and it wasn't the wind. I slowly crept forward, my flashlight held in front of me like a shield. I was getting closer to the edge of the forest, the trees thinning out, when I noticed a flicker of movement in the distance. My heart skipped a beat as I turned my flashlight in that direction. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it more clearly. Dozens of animals, deer, raccoons, even birds, were standing perfectly still in a clearing. They were all facing the cabin, their eyes wide and unblinking. They weren't moving, not even twitching. They were just standing there, staring at the cabin, staring at me. I froze. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out across my back. The animals didn't make a sound. They didn't move. They just stood there, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness as they watched me. Couldn't look away. Felt like they were waiting for something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just watching me. They were watching me, not as part of the natural world, but with something else behind their eyes, something far darker and more calculating. I slowly took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I turned to run, but my feet felt heavy, like they were stuck in mud. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. Every part of me screamed to get inside, to get away from whatever was happening out there. My pulse pounded in my ears as I backed toward the cabin, never once taking my eyes off the creatures in the clearing. When I reached the door, I didn't bother with the key. I threw it open and slammed it behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I stood in the dark cabin, heart racing, trying to catch my breath. I glanced out the window, but I couldn't see anything. No animals, no movement, just the dark, empty woods. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind, made my heart leap into my throat. I kept glancing out the window, waiting for those eyes to appear again, but the night remained quiet. I stayed awake, listening to every sound, wondering if the animals were still out there, watching, waiting. The next morning, when the sun finally rose, I ventured outside. The world looked normal again. No animals, no eerie silence. The woods were full of life again, the sounds of birds and squirrels filling the air. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I packed up my things quickly, trying to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. I didn't want to stick around any longer. I hadn't come for this, whatever this was. As I drove down the mountain, the trees slowly began to thin, and the road opened up to a valley. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, somewhere in the woods watching me. I kept driving, the miles stretching out ahead of me, but the feeling didn't go away. I could still feel those eyes on me no matter how far I drove. I never went back to that cabin, and every time I pass through the mountains now, I can't help but look toward the forest, wondering if the animals are still out there, waiting. We had been looking forward to this weekend for months. It was supposed to be a simple trip to get away from the city, reconnect with each other, and just unwind. A cabin by the lake, no phones, no distractions, just a few days of peace. There were 6 of us in total, all close friends, and we were used to these little weekend getaways. But this one was different. The cabin was old, nestled in the trees near the shore of a small, isolated lake. The kind of place you'd think would be perfect for a quiet escape. We'd rented it through a site that promised a rustic but comfortable experience. It was wooden with a large stone fireplace and big windows that looked out over the water. There was a small dock at the edge of the lake, though it looked like it hadn't been used in years. The water itself was eerily still, the kind of lake where you couldn't tell where the water ended and the sky began. When we arrived, the weather was perfect. Clear skies, a slight breeze, and the sun shining brightly. It was everything we expected. The car ride had been full of laughter, stories, and our usual jokes. As we unpacked and settled into the cabin, everything felt right. We made ourselves at home, cooked some dinner, and sat around the large wooden table, enjoying the peace and the lack of phone signals. That night, after dinner, we lit a fire in the fireplace and sat down with drinks, chatting and joking around. The cabin had a cozy, almost intimate feel. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending little sparks up into the chimney. Outside, the world seemed quiet, peaceful. But then, something changed. I noticed it first, a slight shift in the air, a chill that didn't belong. The wind had picked up, and with it, a thick fog began to roll in over the lake. At first, it was just a little haze, but before long, it had swallowed the entire lake, creeping in from the water and surrounding the cabin. The fog was so dense that it seemed like it had a life of its own, moving in and out of the trees, wrapping itself around the cabin. I remember feeling a little uneasy at first, but I brushed it off. It wasn't like we were in a horror movie. Still, the fog seemed unnatural. It wasn't normal for fog to appear that fast, especially in such a concentrated form. But we kept laughing, kept drinking, and didn't pay it much mind. Then one of our friends, Mark, spoke up. He was always the jokester, always the one to make light of any situation. "You guys hear that?" he asked, a grin on his face. "I swear, it sounds like whispers, coming from the lake." We all laughed at that, but as the wind picked up, I swear, I could hear something too. It was almost like a voice on the wind, faint but definitely there. At first, it was easy to dismiss as the wind itself or the trees, but as the minutes passed, the whispers grew louder. It wasn't just the wind. It sounded like words, but they were too soft to make out. The sound was strange, unsettling. My skin prickled, but I didn't want to say anything. It was probably nothing, right? But then Mark stood up. "No, seriously, I can hear it," he said, looking out into the fog, his face growing serious for the first time that evening. "It's like someone is talking to us." His words made my stomach twist. I turned to look at the others, and they had heard it too. Everyone's faces had changed. We weren't laughing anymore. "I'm going to check it out," Mark said, already moving toward the door. Before anyone could stop him, he opened the door and stepped outside. The fog instantly closed in around him, like it was reaching for him. We could still hear him, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path leading down to the lake. The rest of us stayed inside, hesitating, unsure of what to do. The air felt heavier now, thick with the fog. I could still hear the whispers, but now they seemed more distinct, more urgent, almost like they were calling for us to join them. After a few minutes, Mark's voice broke through the fog. "Hey, there's someone out here," he called out. "There's a man standing by the lake." Everyone froze. "A man?" Emily asked, voice tight. "What do you mean, a man? In this fog?" Mark didn't respond right away, and that only made the situation worse. The seconds dragged on like hours. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside, followed by the others. The fog was thick, and I could barely see my hand in front of my face. We all gathered in a tight group, walking slowly toward the lake, the beam of the flashlight slicing through the mist. "Mark," I called out. "Where are you?" Mark's voice came back to us, quieter now, more cautious. "Over here, near the water." We walked closer, and the mist seemed to part, just enough for us to see him standing by the edge of the lake. But something about the scene was off. Mark was standing still, staring out into the water, but there was no movement in the fog beyond him. No ripples in the lake, no birds, nothing. Just that heavy silence. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Mark, what's going on?" I asked, feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his back to us. "I saw someone," he finally said. "A man. He was standing there, looking out over the water. I called out to him, but he didn't answer." We all looked out toward the lake. The fog was so thick that it was impossible to see beyond a few feet. "What did he look like?" Emily asked, stepping up beside me. "He was tall," Mark replied, still not turning to face us, "wearing a dark coat. But when I called out to him, he just vanished." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean, vanished?" I asked, my voice tight. "I don't know. It's like he just melted into the fog. Like he wasn't even real." We all exchanged uneasy glances. There was no man, no figure standing by the lake. Just the empty, still water and the thick fog that seemed to close in on us, swallowing up everything in its path. My heart started to race, and I felt like we needed to leave, right then. But we couldn't move. We were all frozen in place, staring at the water, unsure of what to do next. Mark was the first to speak again. "Let's go back inside," he said, his voice low and distant. We didn't need any more prompting. We turned and made our way back to the cabin, the fog pressing in around us, even more suffocating now. Inside, we shut the door behind us, and the cabin felt smaller, darker. The fire in the hearth was burning low now, casting flickering shadows on the walls. We all sat down, our eyes darting around the room, unsure of what to say. "What the hell was that?" Emily whispered, breaking the silence. None of us had an answer. The laughter that had filled the cabin earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. We sat there for what felt like hours, the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth our only company. The next morning, the fog had lifted. The sun was up, shining down on the lake, which now seemed almost peaceful. but the events of the night before hung over us like a dark cloud. We couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept thinking about the man Mark had seen or thought he saw by the lake. It didn't make sense. Couldn't. Later that day, we went into town to get some supplies. We stopped at a small diner hoping for some answers. The waitress, an older woman, gave us a strange look when we mentioned the cabin. "You guys staying at that cabin by the lake?" she asked, her voice low. "Yeah," Mark replied, trying to sound casual. "Why?" She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in closer. "You know, there's a story about that place," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago, a man drowned in that lake. No one really knows how it happened. Some say he just disappeared, and his body was never found. Ever since then, people have reported hearing voices by the water. Whispers, like someone's calling to you. They say the lake's got a kind of pull to it, like it wants you to come closer." We stared at her, wide-eyed. It was like she had just confirmed every weird feeling we'd had since the night before. The fog, the whispers, the man by the lake. It all started to make sense in a way we didn't want it to. We left the diner without saying much more, our thoughts heavy and our steps slow. By the time we returned to the cabin, it was late in the afternoon. The lake was still and quiet, just as it had been the day before, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt wrong. That night, we locked the doors and stayed inside. We didn't hear any more whispers, but the sense of unease never left. The fog didn't roll in again, but the air felt thick, like it was holding something back. We didn't talk much, just sat around the fire. The sound of the crackling was the only thing breaking the silence. We all knew it deep down, we weren't staying another night. The next morning, we packed up and left, not saying much to each other. The drive back was quiet. As we drove away from the cabin, I glanced back at the lake one last time. The fog was